The wind had a way of talking to a man after 9 years alone on the high plains, and for Jonah Pike, that whispering wind had become the closest thing to company he allowed himself. He lived in a weather-beaten cabin of sun-dried logs and rusted nails half a day's ride from the nearest town, closer to coyotes and vultures than to people, and he preferred it that way. Men brought trouble, women brought memories, and memories were the one thing he had spent nearly a decade running from. Each morning he would step out onto the porch with his coffee tin, stare across the endless sweep of grassland painted gold by the sun, and let his mind fall into a familiar silence, the kind that made him feel half like a ghost drifting through the world rather than a man still living in it. Folks in town whispered about him when his name came up. Some said he'd killed a man, others that he'd lost his family to sickness or outlaws or Comanche raids, but the truth was simpler and crueler. He had failed the only people who ever needed him, and he had sentenced himself to solitude for the crime. So he worked the land, tended his horses, fixed what needed fixing, and spoke to no one but the stars overhead. Life had settled into that quiet rhythm, steady and predictable as the rising sun, until the morning he found a figure staggering toward his homestead through a curtain of blowing dust, a woman wrapped in tattered buckskin, her braids undone, her face streaked with exhaustion and cold, her steps weaving like she was walking through water instead of air. Jonah's hand went to the revolver at his hip out of habit, but something in her posture, the way she held her arms tight around herself, the way her body shivered though the day was warm, made him hesitate. She collapsed just 10 paces from his porch, hitting the ground with barely a sound. Jonah stood frozen for a breath, maybe two, feeling the sharp kick of old instincts battling older fears. A Comanche woman on his land. 9 years ago he might have reacted differently, but 9 years alone can make a man remember his humanity. He strode toward her, knelt, and saw she was young, maybe late 20s, her skin warm with fever, her lips cracked, her eyes fluttering beneath their lids as though she were fighting nightmares even in sleep. "Ma'am. Can you hear me?" Jonah asked, his voice roughened by years of lack of use. Her eyelids trembled open just long enough for him to catch the barest whisper of a word, warmth, before they rolled back and she went limp again. Something tightened in his chest, something he thought he had burned out of himself long ago, and he lifted her into his arms with a careful strength, carrying her inside as though she were a fragile thing made of glass. The smell of smoke, herbs, and cold air clung to her clothing. He laid her on the cot near the fire, stoked the flames until they burned bright, and draped his spare wool blanket over her. For a long stretch of minutes he simply watched her breathe, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that his world, quiet, sealed off, carefully built, had just cracked open. He brewed hot water, mixed in the last of his precious willow bark, and held the cup to her lips until she swallowed. Hours passed. Outside, thunder growled across the plains, promising a night of storms, but inside the cabin the air felt strangely still, as though the world were holding its breath. When the woman finally stirred again, her eyes opened wider this time, and Jonah saw intelligence and fear flicker inside them. She tried to sit up but winced, grabbing her side. He raised a hand. "Easy. You're safe here." She studied him for a long, heavy moment before speaking in accented English. "Why help me?" Jonah blinked, surprised more by the bluntness of the question than the words themselves. "Because you were freezing to death on my land," he answered simply. "Didn't seem right to leave you to the coyotes." Her gaze softened just a fraction, and she adjusted the blanket around herself. "My name is Taya," she murmured. "I come far. Too far." Jonah nodded once, his jaw tightening. "I'm Jonah." He didn't offer more than that. Names were powerful things on the frontier, and so were pasts, but she didn't press him. Another rumble of thunder rolled over the plains, and Taya flinched at the sound. Jonah noticed, filing it away without comment. He wasn't used to people anymore, but he wasn't blind. Something, or someone, had driven this woman across miles of harsh land to his doorstep. And whatever it was, he had a feeling it wasn't finished yet. He stood and ladled stew from the pot simmering over the fire, placing a bowl into her hands. She ate slowly, but every bite seemed to bring a touch more life into her cheeks. Jonah found himself watching her more than he meant to, studying the determined line of her jaw, the storm-worn strength in her shoulders, and the haunted weight behind her eyes. When she finally finished, she whispered, "I did not come only for warmth." Jonah didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even breathe. The storm outside cracked the sky open with lightning. Taya looked up at him, her voice lowering. "I came because someone is hunting me." Night fell hard over the plains, the kind of night that swallowed sound and color until even the stars seemed hesitant to shine, and Jonah Pike found himself pacing the cabin like a caged animal as Taya slept fitfully on the cot beside the fire. He kept the rifle close, leaning it against the wall where his hand could reach it in half a heartbeat, though he wasn't sure whether the danger was outside, in the storm, in the dark, in the unseen hunters following Taya's trail, or inside, in the shifting ground beneath his feet as he felt parts of himself waking that he'd spent 9 years burying. Taya murmured in her sleep, her breath catching as though grasped by invisible hands, and Jonah found himself leaning toward her, listening, trying to catch a word, a name, a clue to the danger she carried. But all he heard was fear. The storm pummeled the roof like fists against a door. Jonah stirred the fire, casting new light across Taya's face, and for a moment she looked impossibly young, fragile, nothing like the warrior he suspected she truly was. When her eyes snapped open, she shot upright before she seemed to realize where she was. Jonah felt her fear like a knife's edge in the air. "They are close," she whispered. Jonah's jaw clenched. "How close?" Taya wrapped her arms around her stomach as though holding herself together. "Close enough to smell the smoke from your fire." Jonah's pulse kicked. He moved to the window, peeling back the hide curtain just enough to see the sweeping darkness beyond. No lanterns. No riders. No shadows against the lightning flashes. But that meant nothing. Warriors skilled in tracking could move across open land like ghosts. He stepped back from the window. "Why are they hunting you?" he asked, voice low. Taya hesitated, fighting something inside herself, then said, "Because I broke a law of my people. One that cannot be broken without blood following." Jonah felt a chill slide down his spine, colder than the storm. Taya continued, her voice trembling, "I saved the wrong life." Jonah frowned. "You saved a life and they want you dead for it?" Taya nodded with a solemn weight that made Jonah take a step toward her without meaning to. "A boy," she said quietly. "A white boy left for dead by bandits. My people, they wanted to let him go to the Great Spirit. They said it was not our fight. But he was only a child. I could not leave him." Jonah stared, the old world inside him shifting. He had not expected this, a woman hunted not for violence, but for mercy. "Where's the boy now?" Jonah asked. Taya swallowed. "Safe. With a settler family near the big river. But I disobeyed my chief. My punishment was exile." She looked toward the door with haunted eyes. But some do not believe exile is enough. Jonah understood then, she had been running not from an enemy, but from her own people. And now her trail had led straight to him. He scrubbed a hand across his jaw, knowing the smart thing would be to send her away at dawn. Let her problem become the horizon's problem. But when he looked at her, wet hair clinging to her cheek, blanket pulled tight, eyes reflecting fire and fear and stubborn will, he knew he would do no such thing. Jonah Pike had walked away from humanity for 9 long years, but humanity had walked right back to his doorstep. And it needed help. "You're not going anywhere," he said, reaching for the rifle. "Anyone coming for you will have to come through me first." Taya stared at him, stunned, her lips parting as though words had failed her. Outside, the storm's roar faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence that felt like the world holding its breath. Jonah checked the rifle, chambered around, and moved to the door. "Get some rest," he murmured. "The planes'll be watching tonight. And so will I." As he stepped out into the cold night air, he felt a strange unfamiliar fire ignite inside his chest, the same fire he once carried into battle, into love, into loss. A fire he thought was long extinguished. But the truth was clear as the lightning still flickering at the horizon. Jonah Pike was done being alone. And the world had just given him a reason to fight again.